Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the chapter one in your textbook. Today, I want to start with basically exactly where we left off in your textbook, and that was external forces shaping our ethics. And I'm going to take you to the last slide on social culture, or so if you can locate the slide with social culture on it, you're going to find a variety of questions that are there. It says, what cultural values do you think exist in your community, in your province, in Canada? Which of these values do you agree with? Which do you disagree with? So in our second talk, we're going to lead off with that particular. I'm going to give you an example from your textbook and sort of look more closely at an issue around social culture, and so that way we can get into the practical side of learning from what you're reading in your text. So I'm going to read the example from your text, page 20, under social culture. We read in the newspaper that police have discovered another marijuana grow operation and are shocked that it is in our neighborhood. The facts of the case are that it is illegal in Canada to grow, sell, or use marijuana without a permit for health reasons, and the punishment is a fine or a jail term. We may conclude that at the current time in Canadian culture, marijuana use is considered morally wrong, except in certain circumstances related to health issues. Both the fact that there is a law against it and the punishment for being caught indicates this. We may or may not share this opinion, but we cannot help being influenced by it. Even if we smoked marijuana on occasion, we do not view a marijuana grow operator the same way that we view a prairie wheat farmer. We tend to view those who break the law as generally having low standards, moral standards, especially if they do so for no better reason than personal profit. So when we think about that particular example that's in your textbook, it's interesting to explore that we are shaped by our culture, that a lot of the things that we believe come as a product of that shaping that is entirely natural just by virtue of living in a community. So on the marijuana issue, a social issue in Canada, we've changed the laws radically within, or particular Ontario, over the last little while, and people are thinking about that in a variety of different ways. There really, at this point, is probably still a stigma attached to the use of marijuana for a lot of for a lot of Canadians or Ontarians, but we don't. We're starting to see a little bit less of this is less of an issue, and more as part of a fabric of culture. It's something that we have, like we have alcohol and we have other things that people participate in, and that sometimes people get addicted to or find themselves dependent on. So when we talk about the marijuana issue, it is an open issue, but not as severe as it was maybe at one time in our history. But from this example in your textbook, the last part of it is interesting to think about. Why is a person that grows marijuana and makes money thought of differently than a person like a wheat farmer who also grows wheat to make money? Today, we have to really take that question seriously if we're going to develop a balanced perspective on the issue of marijuana, if it is a social issue at this point. So there's a variety of perspectives that can be offered. I would say there's arguments on a lot more. There's arguments on both sides of this, but in order to be able to get answers about what we think on an individual level, we have to look within. We have to self-reflect. We have to think about what beliefs we might have in connection with this and where they came from. Were they did they come as a result of looking at the whole of the issue, looking at the facts, reading the information that we find about it, and all of these things put together? So that's an example. Once we get into that sort of stream of thought, the product is going to be, we can call it safely, self-reflection. But the product is going to be developed moral character. We're actually thinking about this issue as it might apply to ourselves. And of course it might not apply, but it's something that's directly related to what we would call social culture in Canada. On the next page, there's an interesting exercise that I think that everyone should complete, although it's not required. This is an example in your text where you are you're putting things into practice. You're thinking about them and then putting them into practice as connected to yourself. So that exercise, analyzing societal standards in Canada. It says, answer the following questions, and this is on page 21 of your textbook. Answer the following questions individually. For the questions where there is a blank, you may choose to write in names or issues that are meaningful to you. So it starts off by saying, what are the values that make Terry Fox a hero? And so for those of us that don't have any idea or perspective on who Terry Fox is, we might take a look it up, and get some information, and perhaps explore what Terry Fox was, what he was famous for, and what his life was, and what he devoted his time towards doing, and those sorts of things, to get some context. And then we have to, according to this exercise, try to make up our mind on what virtue is best represented by Terry Fox, or what makes him a hero. To which I would probably say to you, courage is what makes Terry Fox a hero for a lot of Canadians and people around the world, because he fought for a cause, and that cause was cancer, and standing up to cancer, which we still see a lot of people fight and devote time towards, because it is one of those social issues that we all face, and we have no sort of control. Well, there's an extent to which we might have control over a sickness like cancer, but it is something that we're all affected by in any given community. So, what makes Terry Fox a hero? Why do you think this, right? So you can write in why you think he's a hero, beyond courage. What else do you think about this? And so again, and then the opposite. What are the values that make Paul Bernardo a villain? For those of us that don't know about Paul Bernardo, we would want to get some perspective and some information and do our research to that end. But we would probably say, well, Paul Bernardo was an evil person, and what he did was, if we're connecting it with an issue, we might say he had no respect for the dignity and sacredness of humanity in what he did. So no respect. So what sort of evaluation would I give myself for respect and lack of respect, and where am I at is again the self-reflective connection that we're making. So you look at the last part of this on that page. What are the values that make, and then there's that blank. Okay, who is the hero in my life? Who would I refer to as a hero, and why, right? And that sort of prompts you to think about what makes a hero, or how you define a hero. And again, that's perspective, but it should be based, or it should be a balanced perspective if we're going to make any progress in being ethical practitioners. So the next part I want to direct your attention to in this chapter towards the end, well, I guess it would be the slide, locus of control. Here, this is an important piece as it connects with this idea of self-reflection and understanding process understanding the process of ethics as starting with self. We have to come to a point where we understand that every one of us has a different perception of how much control we have over different situations or circumstances that we find ourselves in at any given time. So I often mention to students in this portion of the talk that, we often hear about people that are stressed or that suffer from stress in their lives. And the locus of control sort of theory and thinking is that if we can pay more attention to the things that matter in our lives, and that we have more control over, then we're going to be less susceptible to things like stress. And you may have heard others argue or make the claim that stress is self-induced. So if stress is self-induced and I bring it upon myself, then I can take steps to sort of think about which situations cause me the stress, and whether or not I have control over those. And to some degree, I'm going to have control over others, but they're not all going to be the same. And so we understand the locus of control by saying, okay, the amount of control that I have over a circumstance or a situation is going to determine how I react and what I'm thinking about. And I want to avoid being stressed. I want to make informed moral choices. So the example that's on that slide to connect with this is, starts with the question as such: how much control do you have over factors related to your racial heritage or your genetic identity? To which we would say you don't have any control over that. It's an external force that presses upon you, or your thoughts, that you can't do anything about. Nor would you be able to do anything about being born into a poverty-stricken environment, or being born into an abusive home, right? Any of these situations, there's very little control that you had or continue to have to be able to change them. I mean, we might say that if a person comes from a very, poor family financially, that they can make their way to a balanced life and a happy life, but they didn't choose to be poor in the first place. That happened beyond or outside of their control. So here I think about. There is such a thing as saying that a poor family is poor financially, but they could also be very rich in the sort of moral fabric. And you could think about it, when we talk about ethics, that's an interesting sort of line of reason to explore. That, the idea that there are a lot of poor people in any given society that have a very sort of genuine moral fabric about them. They're rich in one way and poor in another, and I think that's sort of consistent. We all have rich and poor within us in different circumstances that apply to our lives. So here we're focusing on the things that I can control and the things that I cannot control. How much control do you have in choosing your behavior in exceptional circumstances or scenarios? So things that don't normally happen. Something happens out of the blue. How much control do you have? Sometimes it's in the moment. You don't have a lot of time to think about it. You might not have very much control over it. Other times you might have time to reflect on and think about what you believe and how it's going to line up with the way that you behave, or the way that you the reactions that you have in different scenarios. How do you react in everyday scenarios? I mean, here we could say there's people that react in a variety of different ways. Some of us are optimistic. Some of us are sort of pessimistic. So, do we have a positive view or a negative view in confronting these situations? And what informs that positive or that optimism? Is it my values? And my values have a lot to do with that. Same thing with pessimism, or the sort of quality that we would say to be very skeptical and really sometimes negative about things. Well, that's having an impact on our daily lives. We say external, outside of my control, internal, within my control. I can control my everyday actions to a point. What do I do in difficult scenarios when things get tough, when I have to make the tough decisions in my life? Like losing a family member. What would I do in this type of situation? And you may have already been through a situation. How much control do you have over that situation? Well, we generally say, if I'm thinking about a particular example, that you don't choose for a family member to get sick. You want to do everything to help that family member, but to some, at some level, things are going to happen like they're going to happen, and we're going to find ways to react. But we have to think about the control that we have. In a family situation, sometimes that gets interesting where, family members don't get along with other family members. And when we're losing a family member, even in death, there's conflict, unfortunately. And we think about something like that and how much control we have over situations. We might say, well, we're part of a family. We make the decision together. But we can also say at the same time that in situations like that, there's usually someone that you depend on. So what are the qualities of the person that you depend on to help you through these difficult scenarios? What happens when you have to deal with a difficult scenario and no one is around to help you? And it is within your control. We might say, well, that's an interesting, how would I react? What would I do? If you look at the next slide on locus of control, what are some situations in your past that you felt were outside of your control? What or why did you think they were outside of your control? What would have given you more control over the situation? These are all factors that we can think about when we ask ourselves these questions. Interesting, what would have given me more control over the situation? Sometimes there isn't anything that I could have done to give me more control over a situation. Sometimes I have to understand and acknowledge that the control that I have won't change. Other times I can influence a change to the control that I have in a situation. Next slide, what are some situations or events in your past or in the present that you felt you were able to exert some control over? And those are things we would want to say we can learn from positively. I can learn from how I'm reacting to the situations in my life. Why were you able to have control over those things or exert some control? Interesting stuff. And we ask ourselves questions like this to start that development of moral character in the way of becoming global citizens. If you move to the next slide, we're going to talk about a couple of different thinkers that explain to us a little bit about how the individual moral compass develops. And this is where we sort of leave off in the chapter. It's not the end point of the chapter, but it's worth paying attention to. So there's two authors here that I'm going to explore because they do sort of set us up for what's to come in the way of the thinkers that we're going to explore, the different theories, the ways of the perspectives, the ideas that allow for us to be ethical practitioners. So you'll see a chart on cognitive moral development, basically level 1, level 2, level 3. We're going to come back to this again, but I want to touch on it now because of the sort of takeaway that comes out of this. We would say Lawrence Kohlberg is a person, a psychologist, who put together a set of levels for moral thinking and for moral development within people, within individuals. What Lawrence Kohlberg did was he conducted a study with I'm forgetting how many people were involved in the study, but all of the people that were involved in the study were male. So from this study, he concluded that there's different stages your that your mind sort of passes through or goes through when you're developing morally. And if you look on that, you'll see very basically it's easy to follow. We start out in our lives with obedience and punishment. We make choices, in other words, because we don't want to get into trouble or we fear punishment. We make choices because we want to obey. So our moral thinking starts there and develops and goes, cultivates over time, the older that we get, but also the more we explore different intellectual discourse, right? We don't have to necessarily do this by, pursuing university education. To become a thinker means to start to get into the regular practice of thinking about your thinking. Thinking about thinking is what we call metacognition. So we start out with obedience and punishment. Then we move into the individualism and exchange, where there is more than one choice, more than one right choice that I can make in different situations. That's the next sort of stage that we progress to. I'm realizing that in my life, for example, when I'm going through a difficult dilemma, circumstance, conflict, that I can make my way through that conflict by exploring more than one option. Whereas in my stage one, I wasn't maybe thinking about that at all. But now that I'm developing myself and understanding that there's more than one option, more than one choice, one right choice even, for me to make in a given situation, the more I start to see that development happen. So this is called the pre-conventional stage, because moral thinking really is just at the beginner's level. Then we get into what we call the conventional level, next, level 2. In the conventional level, we do things sometimes, and this is interesting, because of conformity and social approval, or you've heard the expression before, peer pressure. I did this because they did it. I didn't necessarily want to do it, but I did it. Peer pressure, right? What might be one of the better examples to use in this kind of discussion for that particular stage. We just want to conform. We just want to do what our friends do. We just want to do what our family does. So that is going to have an impact on our decisions and our actions in our everyday lives. And of course, it's going to have connection, and it's going to relate to your workplace. When you get into the workplace and you talk about how employees often conform, and sometimes they conform too much, or they're always looking for social approval. And when that happens, that could have a negative consequence. So, and here I'm thinking, if your company's doing something wrong, then you need to break away from that conformity and do something about it, to the extent that you might be able to do something about it. So the next stage in the conventional phase of this, or the conventional level, is upholding duties and laws. I become law-abiding from understanding. So therein we make the comparison. There are some people who follow the laws or principles because they understand why it is good or moral to follow that law. So here, let's go back to the stage 1 for a reference. When we're in elementary school and we're at the very early ages of our life, even before adolescence, we don't want to get into trouble. So when we break the rules, we sometimes face the punishment, and we don't really think about why we did the wrong, why we did or made the wrong choice for long enough to learn from it. That comes a little bit later. It's sort of like a cognitive process that ticks along the older that we get, and the more that we see of the world around us, the more we develop our perspective. So we uphold duties then, and laws and principles in society because we believe in them. And believing in them requires the work of asking questions such as, what are my thoughts on this, and what formulates my belief? Can I stand on that? Can I be confident with that? And then, of course, the last stage, level 3, and this is Lawrence Kohlberg's work, is called the post-conventional or the principled level. This is where we want to arrive at, where we want to get to. When I say ethical practitioner, this is, we're pointing towards Kohlberg, and we're saying Kohlberg's work, we can learn from that, because he's saying that ethical practicing, or to be a practitioner, requires that we understand things a little bit deeper than most. And how do we do that? Well, we need to understand, for example, what a social contract is. A social contract, here for our purpose, is a contract that you have with your society, with your civil surroundings. When you have a contract with everybody else in a society, you follow the law, and the benefit of you following the law is that you are protected and things remain peaceful. That's the idea. So you're part of that social contract, and the way that you show that you're part of that social contract is by, for example, voting. So we say voting is important because in a democracy, the social contract is formed, is molded by the people in that society. So do I understand justice? Do I understand what it means to have a right? And if I have a right, that also means that others have duties, including myself. Rights and duties often go together. They're like brother and sister, because we can't talk about rights without talking about duties. It makes no sense for me to say I have a right to X if you don't have a duty, or I don't have a duty. So we say rights and duties go together. That's understanding social contract, for example, is a sign or a signal for post-conventional or principled moral conscience. The last part there, principled conscience, is we're thinking about all of these ideas that we're exploring now in the course. We're thinking about thinking, as I've said before, but there are different intellectual people that have formulated theories which are basically collections of ideas. We're going to look at those ideas and learn from them in order to be able to become practitioners. I know that I have more than one avenue to making a choice. And Lawrence Kohlberg really opens that up for us. But Lawrence Kohlberg also opens up what comes next on your slides, feminine moral development. Because Carol Gilligan was a scholar that worked with psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, and she noted some of the things that she wanted to sort of take on to study. And if you recall, I said that Lawrence Kohlberg's work was based on a study that involved males. And so what Carol Gilligan thought was it would be interesting to study how males and females develop morally. And what she was able to find is included on that slide that you see. Moral growth in women is a growth in understanding how their moral choices will affect the important relationships in their lives. So this is a theory that we're going to, again, come back to later on, I think at the end of chapter 4, and we're going to talk about more at length, but it is called the ethics of care. So if you go to the next slide, this is just an expansion of what we're talking about, how Kohlberg gave us many different enlightened sort of ways of discovering that your moral conscience goes through stages, and you develop, you get better, you can be a practitioner. This is how things are occurring. And then Gilligan is inspired to talk not about core cognitive moral development, but adding to it and saying, well, it's more than cognition that makes us moral agents. It is our social surroundings, it's our community, it's the amount of empathy and compassion that we show from each other. And she takes a lot of this from what studies she does that relate to females, on feminine moral development, how that's different, and points us in a different direction. So just to sort of sum up, you'll see a little interesting diagram that I put in the slides as well. Personal, professional, constitutional. We're developing on a personal level. We're developing in understanding the Constitution, or the laws and societal rules, principles around us, and we're exploring professional virtue. And all of these things put together is what the study of values is all about. What we used to call at one time axiology. So that's important for the purpose of making the connection of how all of these things come together. We're looking at self, yes. We're looking at laws around us. We're looking at how can I be professional in the workplace. But we're also including the idea that self-reflection is the first door that we open to our moral growth. Factors that determine the outcome of an ethical choice. So there is, listed on your slide, level of moral growth and development. These now, we can say, as a result of what Gilligan and Dr. Kohlberg have given us, we know now in the study of ethics that your ability to make independent decisions depends on your moral cognition, depends on your development. We also know that you have an ability to consider relationships and responsibilities to others. We learn that by combining these two theories, Kohlberg and Gilligan, so that we can talk about, again, the process of becoming an ethical practitioner. We learn about individual characteristics. All of these here, friends, are the list of things we take away from the work of Kohlberg and Gilligan. Individual characteristics, locus of control, issue intensity, and structured variables. The only thing that we haven't talked about here when we're putting everything together is issue intensity and structured variables. So issue intensity just means that when we're trying to prioritize, balance, when we were talking about stress prior, how critical is this that I have to make a decision on X today? Can I think about it more? Can I ask somebody to help me with it? What is at stake? What's going to be the impact if I make this decision or if I choose this behavior? These are important towards developing, again, the full package of looking at the practice of ethics as it applies to each of us. And then later on, the community, the workplace. Structured variables, and this is important also. What is the structured variables? Well, every situation is different from others. So there are different variables for every dilemma. They're not all the exact same. No two events are the same, right? But a lot of them share they share variables, or the variables have been experienced, and there is sort of we have historical record that we can look back. We have things that we can point towards, references for when people did this before, and how can we learn from those? Those are, of course, the variables that we haven't seen before. It's pretty common when we study ethics for us to immediately realize that there are a lot of situations that are more common than there is situations that are more uncommon. So for the most part, most of the variables we can be aware of. Some of the variables in a situation, they're completely new. So things to think about again with the development. You go to page 25 again. What is moral development? What should we be moving towards? And I think I've said it a number of times in today's talk that it's really self-reflection. It's can I get into the habit? Can I get into the habit of reflecting on the decisions that I make? Can I think about situations in my life right now regardless of where we're at. Where can I focus in my life right now, in the way of self-reflection? What's weighing heavily? And that's usually something that inspires us. What's weighing heavily on my conscience? That's what I would suggest that you think about as students. It's something I think about on a regular in a very regular way. I'll say that. I'll leave you with that also, the quote, all ethical behavior is grounded in our acknowledgement of self through conscious thought, right? So here I'm thinking, there's a time in every day when we have to shut off the clock, or we have to give our mind time to relax, just like we would give our legs, our arms a chance to relax if we're running in a race. In a lot of ways, that analogy serves for the purpose of explaining what we do as humans. But our intellect needs time to break. Needs a break. So as soon as we understand that I have a moral compass as a person, that I can learn from others, that I can think about these situations probably a little bit more than I am doing now, then I'm on the path to becoming an ethical practitioner. If our ethical behavior depends on conscious social or conscious self-reflection, then we must come to realize that character counts. Once the ball starts to turn on self-reflection, we can become ethical practitioners. It is the first step to becoming ethical practitioners. And I'll use another analogy. Today we have picked up the ball. We're looking at a ball. So what am I going to do with this ball that I'm realizing? There's a lot of things that are happening in my life. There's a lot of things that I'm going to have to deal with. How am I going to handle these things? And which of these things are ethical? Which of them should I be prioritizing to put my concentration towards? Once we pick up the ball, we can start rolling with it and learning from these avenues that we're going to explore in the coming chapter. So chapter 2, 3, 4 are the theoretical chapters of your textbook. We're going to be talking about ideas. What are these ideas going to help us with? They're going to help us turn the ball and keep the ball rolling. Because the more options and intellectual discourse and dialogue that we have to keep the ball rolling, the more we are on that path to becoming ethical practitioners. So I'll see you in the next lecture on chapter 2. Thanks, everyone.